Daniel had always loved peace. He wasn't the kind of man who liked loud parties or busy city streets. He enjoyed quiet mornings, hot coffee, the sound of birds, and the feel of cool breeze brushing against his face. For years he had worked in a noisy office in a small town, but every chance he got he would pack a small bag and drive out to the lake. That lake had been his escape since childhood. It wasn't just any lake, it was the place where he had spent summer holidays with his Uncle Ray, the man who had raised him like a father after Daniel's own parents died in a car crash when he was only 9. Uncle Ray's old wooden cabin sat at the edge of the lake, partly hidden between tall pine trees. It was quiet, peaceful, and full of memories. As a boy, Daniel had helped paint the porch, fish from the little wooden dock, and even built birdhouses with his uncle. Over time, the cabin had aged, but it stood strong, like a silent friend waiting patiently for someone to return. 5 years ago, when Uncle Ray passed away, Daniel had been heartbroken. It felt like the last thread to his childhood had been cut. But in his will, Ray had left him the cabin. Along with the keys and a short letter, Ray wrote, "This place saved me. I hope it always gives you the same peace it gave me." Daniel took those words to heart. He didn't move there full-time, but he began visiting the cabin more often. On weekends, he would drive out, sometimes alone, sometimes with a book or his fishing rod. He kept the cabin clean, repaired what he could, and even installed solar lights on the porch. For him, the cabin wasn't just a property, it was home. But things began to change around the lake. Over the past few years, Daniel noticed that new modern houses were popping up on the opposite side of the lake. Big houses with huge glass windows, stone paths, security cameras, and fancy cars parked outside. A few of the older cabins had been bought and torn down. People who had lived there for decades were gone, replaced by rich folks from the city. It didn't bother Daniel too much. He liked his side of the lake, quieter, older, more natural. One morning, while sipping coffee on his porch, Daniel noticed a couple walking past his cabin. They were dressed in expensive outdoor clothes, and the woman was talking loudly on her phone. She glanced at Daniel briefly and then whispered something to the man, both of them frowning at the sight of his cabin. Daniel simply nodded politely and went back inside. A week later, things took a strange turn. Daniel arrived at the cabin on a Friday evening after work. As he got out of his truck, he noticed something taped to the front door. It was a large white envelope with notice written in bold red letters. He tore it open and unfolded a thick letter filled with legal language and a logo at the top that read, "Silver Pines Lakeside Community Association." Confused, he sat on the porch and started reading. The letter stated that he was in violation of several community guidelines, including improper property maintenance, non-standard exterior paint, and unauthorized construction of lakeside structures. It also mentioned that he was required to pay an HOA membership fee and was subject to penalties if violations were not corrected within 30 days. Daniel blinked in confusion. HOA? He had never signed up for a homeowners association. He had never heard of one at the lake. His uncle had never mentioned it, and he had never received any paperwork or meetings about it before. It made no sense. The next morning, Daniel drove over to the nearest new house that had a similar logo on a mailbox. He rang the doorbell, and after a minute, a woman opened the door. She was tall, well-dressed, and looked slightly annoyed. Before Daniel could speak, she said, "Oh, you must be from the old cabin. We've been expecting you." Her name was Cynthia, and she introduced herself as the HOA president. She invited Daniel inside but spoke to him like he was a delivery boy or a stranger, not a neighbor. Daniel explained that he had received the notice and didn't understand what was going on. Cynthia sighed and said, "Mr. Jones, all properties around the lake are now part of the Silver Pines Lakeside community. We've established rules to maintain quality and property value. Your cabin unfortunately doesn't meet the visual or safety standards." Daniel tried to remain calm. "But I never joined any association. My cabin has been here for over 30 years. My uncle owned this land before any of these houses were built." Cynthia gave a tight smile. "Well, times change, and our community must maintain a certain look. You'll need to repaint the cabin, remove that old dock, and pay your dues like everyone else." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He had always been respectful and quiet, never caused trouble. Now he was being told he couldn't live in his own cabin unless he followed rules he never agreed to. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. Daniel started receiving more letters from the HOA. One claimed that his fishing shed violated setback rules. Another said the old wooden swing hanging from a tree was unsightly. He even got a warning about unauthorized gardening because of the wildflowers he had planted along the fence. It felt like he was being watched all the time. He tried to avoid conflict. He repainted the cabin himself using a color close to the approved palette. He removed the flowers, even though they brought butterflies and reminded him of his uncle. But the letters kept coming. Now they said he owed hundreds of dollars in back dues, even though he had never agreed to any contract. Neighbors started acting differently too. Some gave him strange looks. A couple of new families avoided him completely. The atmosphere had changed. What used to be his peaceful retreat now felt cold and hostile. Then one evening, a new notice arrived. This time, with more serious language. Final warning. If non-compliance continues, you will be subject to fines and potential legal action, including removal from the property. It ended with, refusal to cooperate with community standards may result in revocation of residency. Rights. Daniel sat in his truck for a long time that night, staring at the lake. The water was calm, glowing under the moonlight. He remembered fishing there with Uncle Ray, making sandwiches on the porch, learning how to build a campfire. He thought of all the summers they spent talking about life, about peace, about finding happiness in simple things. Now that peace was under threat. Strangers were trying to push him out of his own land, acting as if he didn't belong. But something inside Daniel shifted that night. He realized he had been too quiet, too passive. He had let them treat him like he was the outsider, when in truth, he had been there long before they ever knew the lake existed. He made a decision. The next day, he drove back home and opened the old chest his uncle had left him. It was full of dusty folders and papers, maps, letters, and photos. At the bottom was a thick envelope marked Property Deeds and Original Purchase Agreement, Lakefront Parcel. Daniel opened it, not knowing then that what he would find would change everything. After reading the final warning notice from the HOA, Daniel felt a mix of frustration, confusion, and anger. The calm and peaceful lake retreat he had cherished for so long suddenly felt like a place where he was being pushed out. But Daniel was not the type to give up easily. He had lived through tough times with his uncle, learned patience and quiet strength. Now, more than ever, he knew he had to stand up for what was rightfully his. The next morning, Daniel went back to the lake cabin determined to find out everything about this HOA. He started by walking around the neighborhood, observing the homes that surrounded the lake. Most of the houses were new and shiny, built with modern designs that looked very different from his simple wooden cabin. He noticed well-manicured lawns, expensive cars, and high fences. The people he saw seemed to move quickly, often staring at him with suspicion or disinterest. One afternoon, while he was fixing a loose board on his porch, two men from the community association came by. They introduced themselves as HOA inspectors. They had clipboards and cameras and began taking pictures of Daniel's cabin, the dock, and his tool shed. Daniel tried to explain that he was working on repairs, but they said their job was to ensure all the properties followed the HOA rules. The inspectors pointed out small issues: peeling paint on the porch railing, weeds growing near the foundation, the dock not matching the approved design. Daniel listened patiently, but inside he was growing more upset. He felt like his home was being judged unfairly because it didn't fit into the HOA's picture of a perfect neighborhood. After the inspectors left, Daniel called Cynthia, the HOA president, to discuss the mounting citations. Cynthia answered curtly and told him he needed to bring the property up to their standards immediately. When Daniel asked about the membership fees he supposedly owed, Cynthia said that all homeowners were required to pay, regardless of when they bought their homes. Daniel told her he never signed any agreement, but Cynthia dismissed his concerns, saying it was standard procedure for everyone living there. Daniel started talking to a few neighbors, hoping to find allies or learn more about the HOA's rules. One elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, told him that the HOA had only been formed 2 years ago, after many new buyers moved in. Before that, there were no rules or fees. She said some people had resisted at first, but eventually gave in because they didn't want to be the odd ones out. Another neighbor, a young couple named Mark and Lisa, explained how the HOA controlled everything, from the color of front doors to the types of plants allowed in gardens. They admitted that sometimes the rules seemed strict and unfair, but most people followed them to avoid fines. Daniel realized he was alone in resisting. The community had changed, and he was an old holdout in a new world. Yet, he wasn't ready to back down. Over the next few weeks, the HOA's letters and warnings increased. Daniel was fined hundreds of dollars for violations he couldn't fix quickly. The shed's roof had a small leak, the dock's wood was aging, and the paint wasn't the exact shade required. But Daniel's income was modest, and repairing everything to the HOA's expensive standards was difficult. One day, a letter arrived that shocked Daniel. It stated he had 30 days to remove all unauthorized structures or face legal eviction from the property. The letter threatened court action and liens on his land. Daniel read the words again, feeling his chest tighten. He wasn't just being asked to fix his cabin. He was being told to leave it altogether. He tried to speak to Cynthia again, but she refused to meet him in person. The HOA board had voted to proceed with legal action if he didn't comply. Daniel felt cornered, trapped in a battle he had never expected. Despite the pressure, Daniel refused to give up his home. Instead, he started searching for any paperwork or evidence that could prove his ownership rights. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table pulling out the box of documents left by Uncle Ray. He found old maps, tax receipts, letters from previous owners, and finally, a thick packet labeled Title and Deeds. Carefully, Daniel studied the documents. They were old and yellowed but clearly showed his uncle had purchased the entire lakefront property decades ago. The deed listed the boundaries of the land, and the description included not only the cabin area but also the lake access points, the dock space, and the land surrounding several neighboring properties. The papers showed that the entire lake lot was owned by Uncle Ray, and now, after his passing, by Daniel. This was a game changer. Daniel felt a surge of hope. If he truly owned all that land, then the HOA had no right to tell him what to do or to threaten eviction. The houses around the lake might belong to other people, but the land beneath their docks and yards, at least parts of it, belonged to Daniel. But Daniel also realized this meant the HOA and some neighbors might have been using or building on his property without permission for years. That could cause problems or conflict. He decided to contact a local real estate lawyer to understand his rights better. The lawyer was surprised by the extent of Daniel's ownership. He confirmed that many of the properties in the HOA community had encroached on Daniel's land, at least according to the legal documents. The lawyer advised Daniel to prepare for a legal battle, but also suggested trying to resolve the conflict peacefully if possible. He warned Daniel that the HOA might resist strongly and that tensions could rise. Daniel felt overwhelmed but ready. He now understood the real story behind the harassment. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were trying to take control of land that wasn't theirs. He also thought about the community itself. The new neighbors didn't know the history of the lake. They thought the HOA was just normal and fair, but in reality, it was a way to pressure old owners like Daniel out, to control the lakefront and increase property values for themselves. Daniel began gathering more proof. He researched old county records, spoke with longtime residents who remembered when Uncle Ray had owned the land, and collected photos of the property over the years. Each piece strengthened his case. At the same time, Daniel tried to remain calm. He continued repairing his cabin, staying polite but firm in all communications with the HOA. He didn't want to create enemies but knew he had to protect his home. One day, Cynthia sent a new letter demanding immediate payment of HOA dues and threatening to block Daniel's access to the lake's private roads if he didn't comply. Daniel replied with a letter of his own, attaching copies of the deeds and explaining his ownership. He asked them to stop harassment until the matter could be legally clarified. The HOA board ignored his letter. Instead, they started blocking his access to community facilities, including the boat ramp and the lakeside walking paths. Daniel had to park his truck farther away and walk a longer distance to reach his cabin. Neighbors who had once greeted him warmly began avoiding him. Some whispered behind his back, labeling him a troublemaker or difficult. Daniel felt isolated but determined. He spent many nights thinking about his next move. He realized that revealing the full truth about his ownership was the only way to stop the HOA's bullying. But he also knew that doing so could cause conflict in the community. Some people might lose access to parts of the lake or land they had used for years. Despite the risks, Daniel decided it was time to confront the HOA officially. He planned to attend the next HOA meeting with his lawyer and the documents proving his ownership. He wanted to end the harassment once and for all. For Daniel, the lake cabin was more than just property. It was his connection to his uncle, to his childhood, and to the peace he had always sought. He was ready to fight for it, no matter what. After weeks of feeling cornered by the Homeowners Association's constant threats, Daniel knew he had to find a way to protect his cabin and the land his uncle had left him. The stack of old papers and deeds he found months ago was still on his kitchen table, and every day he looked at them hoping for a clue or a spark of courage to fight back. He decided to dig deeper into the history of the property. Daniel spent hours at the local county records office, pulling out old maps, property, records, and legal documents. The clerk, an older man with a kind smile, helped him find deeds dating back several decades. Daniel found records proving that his uncle had legally bought the entire lakeside parcel, which included not just the small cabin lot, but also a large area surrounding the lake, including the shoreline, the docks, and even the private roads that the HOA members now used. Each new document Daniel found was like a small victory. It confirmed what he had suspected, that the HOA had no legal claim over the land he owned. He learned that the HOA had been formed recently, mostly by new homeowners who bought plots of land but didn't have clear titles to the shore or some of the communal spaces. Daniel's uncle, decades ago, had purchased the land legally and had never given up ownership. The fact that the HOA board had been collecting fees and enforcing rules on his property was, in fact, illegal. But uncovering the truth was only the first step. Daniel realized that most of the neighbors did not know the full story. Many of them assumed that the HOA had rightful authority over the lake area because it was written in their membership agreements that Daniel never signed. They believed the community had a right to enforce rules and collect dues. Daniel wondered how to share his findings without causing chaos, but also without letting the HOA continue its harassment. One evening, Daniel invited his lawyer over to review the papers. The lawyer was a calm man with a clear voice and a sharp mind. He explained that Daniel's ownership documents were very strong. Legally, Daniel owned the land outright and had more rights than the HOA or any individual homeowner. The lawyer advised Daniel to be careful but firm. The HOA might fight back with legal action, but Daniel was ready. With his lawyer's help, Daniel began drafting letters. He carefully explained the legal facts, asked the HOA to stop the harassment, and warned that if they continued, Daniel would take the matter to court. Daniel wanted to give the HOA a chance to back down before things got ugly. Despite this, Cynthia, the HOA president, refused to accept Daniel's claims. She sent a reply dismissing his documents as irrelevant and outdated. She insisted the HOA had jurisdiction over all properties in the community. The letter was cold and threatening. Daniel's frustration grew, but he didn't lose hope. Instead, he gathered more evidence. He found old photographs of the lake from the 1970s, showing his uncle's cabin standing alone on the shore before any of the fancy new houses were built. He talked to some older neighbors, people who had lived around the lake for decades and recorded their stories. They remembered Uncle Ray as the true owner of the land and the cabin, and they agreed that the HOA's claims were new and questionable. Daniel also noticed something else. Many of the new houses had built docks or fences that extended onto the land his uncle had owned. If his ownership was confirmed, those structures were technically trespassing. This gave Daniel more leverage, but also made him worry about potential conflict. Still, Daniel decided to focus on the facts and the law. He wanted to solve this without turning neighbors against him or creating hostility. As the next HOA meeting approached, Daniel felt a mix of nervousness and determination. He prepared his documents carefully and practiced what he would say. He wanted to present his case clearly and respectfully, without anger or threats. On the day of the meeting, Daniel arrived early. The community hall was filled with familiar faces, many of whom glanced at him with curiosity or suspicion. Cynthia was already there, looking stern and confident. When the meeting began, Daniel waited for his turn. When he finally spoke, he showed the original deeds and maps. He explained how the land was legally owned by his uncle and now by him, and that the HOA had no right to enforce rules on his property. There was a stunned silence. Some people whispered to each other. Cynthia tried to interrupt, but Daniel's lawyer politely asked for her to hold her comments until the end. Daniel went on to explain that many of the HOA's claims against him were baseless because they were made without understanding the real ownership. He said he hoped the community could find a way to coexist peacefully, but that he would protect his rights. After his presentation, the room was filled with mixed reactions. Some neighbors were supportive, others skeptical, and some openly hostile. Cynthia called for a vote to reject Daniel's claims, but Daniel's lawyer reminded everyone that this was a legal matter, not a community vote. The meeting ended with no clear resolution, but Daniel knew he had planted a seed of truth. The HOA could no longer ignore the legal facts. In the days that followed, Daniel received calls from neighbors asking questions. Some apologized for being cold before. Others wanted to know more about the history of the lake. Daniel also heard rumors that Cynthia and the board were consulting lawyers themselves. The battle was far from over, but Daniel felt stronger than ever. He continued maintaining his cabin and land, confident that the truth was on his side. He knew that legal battles could take time, but he was ready to see it through. For Daniel, the lake was not just a place on a map. It was a legacy, a connection to his uncle, and a home he would fight for. After the HOA meeting, Daniel knew the battle was far from over. Even though he had presented strong evidence proving his ownership, the HOA board was determined to fight back. Cynthia and her group were not just a group of neighbors. They were a well-organized association with lawyers and a budget, and they used all their power to try to push Daniel out. Daniel's days became filled with legal letters and notices. The HOA claimed that because Daniel hadn't paid fees for years, he owed a huge sum, thousands of dollars, in back payments, fines, and penalties. Daniel's lawyer reviewed the claims and said many of the fees were unfair because Daniel had never agreed to join the HOA. The lawyer helped Daniel draft responses denying the fees and demanding proof. Meanwhile, Cynthia and the board started organizing meetings behind closed doors, planning how to handle Daniel's ownership claim. Daniel heard from a few neighbors that some on the board were angry and wanted to force Daniel off the property at any cost. There was even talk of filing a lawsuit to try to quiet title, a legal action to declare who owns the land for sure. Daniel understood that this was becoming a real war over the land, but he was not afraid. He spent many evenings talking with his lawyer, making plans and preparing documents. His goal was clear: protect his cabin and the land, and stop the HOA's harassment. But Daniel also felt the weight of the fight on his spirit. It was not just a legal battle. It was personal. This was the place where he had memories of his uncle, the place that felt like home. And now, the neighbors who lived nearby treated him like an enemy. One day, as Daniel was fixing the dock, he noticed a group of men standing near the shoreline. They were measuring the land and taking pictures. Daniel approached them, asking who they were. They said they were surveyors hired by the HOA to prepare for a legal case. Daniel watched as they moved along the boundaries shown in his deeds. He felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, fear, but also determination. If the HOA wanted a fight, he was ready. To support his case, Daniel began inviting longtime residents to document their memories of the land. He recorded interviews, collected old photos, and wrote down stories. These personal accounts became powerful proof that the land had belonged to his uncle and had been in his family for decades. At the same time, Daniel worked on improving his property. He repaired the cabin, cleaned up the yard, and made sure everything was in good condition. He wanted to show that he was a responsible owner and that the HOA's complaints were baseless. The community's attitude towards Daniel remained mixed. Some neighbors admired his courage and quietly supported him. Others avoided him or sided with the HOA. Daniel tried not to let their opinions affect him. He focused on the truth and on protecting what was his. Then came a surprise. One afternoon, Cynthia called Daniel to propose a private meeting. Daniel was cautious but agreed. At the meeting, Cynthia said the HOA was willing to negotiate if Daniel would agree to pay reduced fees and follow certain rules going forward. She said it was a chance to avoid costly legal battles and keep the peace. Daniel listened but politely declined. He told Cynthia that he could not accept paying fees for land he owned outright and that he wanted respect for his property rights. He said he was willing to work with the community but not under unfair conditions. The conversation ended without agreement, but Daniel felt proud. He had stood his ground without anger or bitterness. Over the next months, the HOA started formal, legal proceedings. They filed a lawsuit claiming Daniel was trespassing on HOA property and demanding eviction. Daniel's lawyer responded by filing a counterclaim, proving Daniel's ownership with deeds, surveys, and witness statements. The court case became tense. Daniel spent hours preparing documents and meeting with his lawyer. He learned about legal terms, property law, and how to defend his rights. It was stressful, but also empowering. During this time, Daniel's story began to spread in the local news. A journalist heard about the conflict and visited the lake. She wrote an article about the fight between the old cabin owner and the new HOA, highlighting the complex history and the struggle for justice. The article brought attention to Daniel's case. Some neighbors who had been quiet now reached out to offer support. Others criticized the HOA for being too harsh. Daniel realized his fight was about more than just one cabin. It was about standing up for the rights of small owners against powerful groups trying to take control. It was about preserving the history and character of the lake community. Despite the legal battles and tension, Daniel kept going back to the cabin every weekend. He fished by the lake, repaired the dock, and sat on the porch remembering his uncle's words. The fight was hard, but the lake still gave him peace. Finally, after months of court hearings, the judge ruled in Daniel's favor. The court recognized that Daniel legally owned the lake lot and that the HOA had no right to force him to pay fees or remove structures. The judge ordered the HOA to stop all harassment and to respect Daniel's property rights. The ruling was a huge relief. Daniel felt like a heavy burden had lifted. He could finally enjoy his cabin without fear of eviction. After the decision, Daniel reached out to the HOA to rebuild relationships with neighbors. He hoped the community could heal and live peacefully together. The fight had been long and difficult, but Daniel knew it was worth it. He had protected his family's legacy and stood up for what was right. His cabin by the lake was not just a place to escape. It was a symbol of perseverance, justice, and the power of standing up for yourself. After the court ruling that recognized Daniel's ownership of the lake lot and protected his cabin from the HOA's harassment, a new chapter began in his life. The battle was over, but the real work of rebuilding relationships and healing the community was just starting. For many years, the neighborhood around the lake had been divided. The arrival of the HOA and their strict rules had created tension between longtime owners like Daniel and the newer residents who wanted a neat, uniform community. Now that the court had sided with Daniel, some neighbors who had supported the HOA felt uneasy, while others quietly admitted that the rules had been too harsh. Daniel understood that winning in court was not the same as winning friends. He remembered his uncle's advice about kindness and patience. Even though some neighbors had been unfriendly, Daniel wanted to reach out and try to build bridges. The lake was a shared place, and he hoped they could all enjoy it peacefully. He started by inviting a few neighbors to his cabin for a small gathering. The invitation was simple: coffee, snacks, and a chance to talk without anger or judgment. Some neighbors hesitated but accepted. That day, Daniel shared stories about his uncle and the history of the lake. He showed old photos and explained why the land was so important to him. The neighbors listened. Some apologized for misunderstandings, others thanked Daniel for opening up. The ice began to break. Daniel also joined community events organized by the HOA, but this time things felt different. He was no longer seen as an outsider, but as a part of the neighborhood. He helped with cleanup days, fishing tournaments, and holiday celebrations. Over time, Daniel noticed that the HOA board itself started to change. New members were elected who were more open-minded and willing to work with longtime owners like him. The harsh rules were softened, and the fees were adjusted fairly. Daniel's story became a symbol of standing up for what is right and the power of fairness. Local newspapers and community newsletters shared updates about how the neighborhood was healing after the conflict. Daniel also continued to care for his cabin and the land. He planted new trees, repaired the dock, and made small improvements that blended the old with the new. The cabin, once seen as out of place, became a cherished part of the lake's character. Visitors who came to the lake often asked Daniel about the history, and he happily told them about his uncle, the struggles, and the victory. For Daniel, sharing the story was a way to honor his family and remind everyone about respect, honesty, and community. The legal battle had been tough, but it taught Daniel many things about patience, courage, and the importance of knowing your rights. He felt proud that he stood his ground without bitterness or anger. One afternoon, Daniel sat on his porch watching the sun set over the lake. Children played nearby, neighbors waved hello, and the water shimmered peacefully. The lake was the same, yet different, a place where old and new could come together. Daniel smiled, thinking about how far he had come. His uncle's cabin was safe, the community was healing, and the future looked bright. He knew that no matter what challenges might come next, he would always protect this special place. It was his home, his legacy, and his peace. And so, life by the lake continued, full of stories, friendships, and hope. A true testament to the power of standing up for what is right and the strength found in unity.